Apologies for that. I was interrupted, but this will be sort of a continuation. Um, so one of the things that I think is worth remembering is that slavery did not exist or did not arrive as a kind of well-formed and well-constructed, completed entity in terms of the rules and regulations that surrounded slavery. And it was something that evolved over time. One of the striking things that is worth noting, though, about the transatlantic slave trade is that it was specifically racially defined. And I think this is hugely important. There were systems related to criminal justice systems, related to laws of punishment, laws of retribution and repayment that involved certain classes of society within the European sphere, So much of what happened during that period, and I'm talking about the period of the Elizabethan period, the 1500s onwards, which is the period of exploration and so-called discovery. Much of what was happening during that period involved the exportation of criminals from these countries to the colonies. They were exported to the colonies as a punishment, and they would be given a certain amount of years while they were being punished, and that would then, after that period, which was a period of indentureship, where they were not paid but they had to work. After they had completed their sentences, they would then be allowed to be free. They could not return to the main countries, but would have to remain in the colonies, and they were therefore seen as some of the early settlers and the people who would begin the settlement and development of those societies. I think it's well known that much of Australia was for a time a penal colony. And to a large extent, those people who settled in Australia, the people who live in Australia, many of the Europeans who live in Australia, happen to be descendants of formerly imprisoned convicts who are living there. Of course, the population of Australia has changed dramatically and drastically. It's more diverse, and it has people who have come at different periods. But that's part of the history of it. And so were people who were transported to the Caribbean, and especially those who were transported to the United States as well. Now, one of the interesting, and then of course there was another sort of influx of people who came into this new world as part of the ambitions of these British colonial forces. And those are people who were escaping persecution, escaping religious persecution and cultural persecution, and some who were escaping wars and escaping starvation. In America, there was a period when Irish immigrants were fleeing from what was called the potato famine and starvation, and managed to come into America to settle in America. And others were fleeing religious persecution. In fact, that formed a significant proportion of the American population, especially when Protestants were leaving Catholic countries to come and settle in America, or Catholics were leaving Protestant-heavy countries and were coming to try and find freedom of expression, freedom of thought, freedom to practice their religions any way that they wanted to. So these would be formed as part of the entity. Now, amongst those, so one of the interesting things that happened was the emergence of a mercantilistic system, and first of all, the emergence of an agricultural system in the New World, and especially in the Americas, meant that there was a need for a labor force to be able to produce the materials that were needed. So there were two things that were needed for these colonies. One was to populate the colonies so that the land, and in many ways minerals and so on and so forth, could be exploited. But at the same time, these colonies had to be settled, and also they became incredible sources of provenance for and wealth for the colonizing forces through this area of agricultural practice. And so we can come to the end of the story and look back and think of what sugarcane meant to the Caribbean islands, what cotton meant to the Caribbean islands, what spices meant to the Caribbean islands, and so on. And I mean, it's telling because, of course, one of the reasons why Columbus was able to get the funding and the support to make the trip to the New World from the Ferdinand and Isabella in the Spanish government. One of the reasons they were funded was because Columbus was promising them a shorter route to an alternate route to the spice countries in the east. You know, as he was saying that we can get to China that way. What Columbus hadn't reckoned was there was this massive continent called America and this incredibly massive ocean called the Pacific Ocean that separated that came between what he thought was going to be the place that he settled. That's why, you know, the Caribbean were called the Indies, because the assumption was that they were already in India, but of course they weren't. They were mistaken about that. And so what began to happen, of course, was in settlements in South America and settlements in the Caribbean, and then later on in the Americas, was that there was a need for trade and for also exploiting the land and for production, which meant that they needed labor. All right, and initially, the labor force was to use the indigenous people in those areas as the source of labor. There's a big battle that would take place over about 100-year period in Spanish, the Spanish Americas, that would affect significantly what would happen in the whole two continents within that period of time. And the big battle happened to be an ethical and moral and religious battle, because of course one of the first things that happened when the Spanish had settled places like what we now call Mexico and all parts of the Caribbean, whether it's Hispaniola, Jamaica, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and then of course further into Argentina, Colombia, and so on. What was beginning to happen was that they were beginning to take over places, kingdoms, and whole societies. The Incas, the Aztecs, and the Mayans. These large, major populations. To take over their property, to take over their space, to take over their countries, literally to overthrow those countries, and also to then begin to exploit the people, the defeated people, to use them as slave labor. There became a sort of a second force, a contrary force among particularly Jesuit and Dominican friars and priests from the Catholic Church, who began to feel as if the effort, which was the primary effort that they understood to be for the colonial enterprise, for the so-called discovery, the effort was supposed to be primarily to convert and to take the message and the teachings of Christ to these societies and so on. And of course, what began to happen was that the exploitation of these people for their labor and so on and so forth began to precipitate what was functionally a genocide, a destruction of these societies by the brutality of the colonizing forces, the mercantilistic and militaristic part of the colonizing forces. And these Jesuit priests and these Dominican friars began to speak up against this. One of the most famous friars in this regard was a man called Bartholomew de las Casas. And Bartholomew de las Casas had embarked on a campaign in the interests of the Indians. He was committed to liberate the Indians from being the victims of enslavement, forced slavery, forced labor in the New World. His petition over and over would eventually reach the Vatican, and the case was put to the Vatican over a series of appeals, a series of debates, and a series of arguments, where he was proposing that since it was evident, and this was hugely important, his argument was that it was evident that the Indians, namely the indigenous people of, particularly of where we call Mexico, the Mayans and the Aztecs, and in the Caribbean islands, the Caribs and the what was then called the Arawaks, but Taino would be the more appropriate term. His argument was that they were able to convert to Christianity, and he would bring examples of these people to Spain, to the court, to the Vatican, to demonstrate that they could be converted. They could be converted. They could speak the language, Spanish, and so on. And so he said, if they had the capacity to be converted, then it meant that they had souls, and if they had souls, then they should be treated as fellow human beings with the capacity to be saved rather than to be enslaved. So as early as that period, there was a genuine debate about the nature and the rights to enslave people, human beings. Because, of course, the rationale was that these people were not full humans. They did not have souls, and therefore they could be treated like animals, treated well, but still treated as animals and be used. And he prevailed. Bartholomew de las Casas prevailed, but he prevailed in a very peculiar way because, of course, one of the great questions that was asked of him in the Vatican by many of the cardinals and so on was a pragmatic one. And the pragmatic one was that if in fact, it was true that these people could not be enslaved and so on, then the entire enterprise had a major, major, major hindrance. And the hindrance was, where would you get labor to do this work? Bartholomew de las Casas famously observed that while it was evident and while he had all the evidence to support the claim that the indigenous people, the native people of the Americas were humans and had souls, essentially, to use a colloquial term, he was saying that the jury was out in terms of the African. That examination and that study had not been done, and he perceived that the African, without any evidence, could be perceived as not having the souls that were required. At which point, it gave a kind of a Vatican spiritual, papal sanctioning of the enslaving of Africans. And that enslaving of Africans would then be sanctioned and precipitated significantly for another 300 to 400 years, beginning with the Portuguese, who would then be importing slaves to places like Brazil, taking them from Angola and so on and so forth. And then, of course, everybody started to get into the game because of these Africans who were being captured and brought into these places were perceived to be not quite human, and therefore they were free to be enslaved. We'll continue this discussion in a few minutes.